right, okay, perfect. So welcome on this snowy beginning of winter evening to the Design Matters lecture series. My name is John Brown. I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape. And I want to start by acknowledging that we are meeting today on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, and as well that the city of Calgary is home to Métis Nation Region 3. I think it's also worth pointing out that at this point in time in our history that the Métis Nations of Alberta are voting and creating they're working on their self-governance, which is a big step forward, and maybe for Kristian, who I guess you've been in Canada a few times, but I'm not sure if you participated in these acknowledgements, but as part of our truth and reconciliation process with our Indigenous people, we need to not only acknowledge their stewardship of the land, and there's a direct connection with the notion of design as ecology and the incredible stewardship for many millennia that Indigenous peoples did, but also I think we need to acknowledge our own responsibility as professionals for disrupting that, for following through or not following through and breaking the promises of Treaty 7, and how we as professionals and also as individual citizens have an obligation to consider how we move forward in a more equitable kind of way. It's particularly relevant, I think, for architects, planners, and landscape architects, particularly when we meet here, which is only, as I say, a couple of hundred yards away from the crossing of the Bow and the Elbow, which was the traditional meeting place of our Indigenous people, and given the kind of topics that we are interested in when it comes to stewardship, when it comes to social justice, to the relationship of our society to the built environment and the natural environment, we have a lot that we can learn and a lot that we owe to our Indigenous partners. So, as I said, welcome to this evening. I'm really excited. I'm particularly excited that there's so many people here. When I woke up and saw the blizzard, well, it's not really a blizzard, but a snowstorm outside, I thought, oh my goodness, first of all, I hope the speaker gets here, and second of all, I hope somebody else comes here other than me to listen to him speak. So the fact that you're all here is wonderful, and thank you very much. On the docket, as you know, we have an active series of outreach opportunities. On November 17th, up at the university, we have the gallery opening in our Stantec gallery, an open house that's featuring the work of our students that were in Barcelona and Zurich this past summer, our studies abroad programs. I know that there are some alumni in the audience today that probably remember fondly and maybe hazily their time in Barcelona and Zurich, and so this is this student's opportunity to come out and talk about what they've done. Here and with Design Matters on December 30th, we have Steve DeRoy, who's the founding director of the Firelight Group, which is exploring Indigenous approaches to planning. And I think that that's going to be a particularly interesting lecture. I also want to thank our sponsor for this evening, who did telephone to say that they were in Edmonton and there was no possible way that they were going to be able to drive down here to be able to do the introduction. And so I will be introducing the speaker as well. The Canadian Wood Council is our sponsor for this evening, and I think we owe them one paragraph of description of who they are and as part of our thank you. So for over 60 years, the Canadian Wood Council has supported their members and expanded wood use in construction by accelerating market demand for Canadian wood products and championed responsible leadership through excellence in codes, standards, and regulations. Canadian Wood Council also provides technical knowledge for the construction sector through our market-leading Woodworks initiative. So thank you to Canadian Woodworks for sponsoring this lecture and enabling us to bring Kristian Lars Ahlmark to Calgary. So on that note, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Kristian to you this evening. Kristian joined Schmidt Hammer Lassen Architects of Copenhagen and lots of other places around the world in 2001, and since then he has managed projects worldwide, including North America and China. He counts with extraordinary technical skills and creative energy. I'm not sure how you count, but that seems to be a typo. But it's more than on your fingers, I guess, right? He has extraordinary technical skills and creative energy, and has been involved in many of the studio's competition projects, including the Rocket&Tigerli, the world's tallest residential timber building in Switzerland, via a mixed-use focal point for the modern Oslo, Norway, a 22,310 meter squared educational facility for the University of Applied Sciences in Utrecht, the Netherlands, and Malmö Live, the concert hall, hotel, and congress center in Sweden. Ahlmark regularly lectures on topics spanning the architectural process at universities, conferences, and organizations worldwide, and it is a delight and an honor that he is here today to share with us his perspective on architecture and design as ecology. So, Kristian, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. It's always nice to hear somebody read those words about oneself, the creative energy. So, and thank you so much for inviting me to come here to speak today. I can sort of start by apologizing that I have way too many slides, but I think I was promised around 45 minutes to talk today, which obviously would be extremely unsustainable to fly all the way from Copenhagen to only speak for so little. So I took the liberty to do almost twice as many, and we can. I sectionized it, so don't worry. We can stop if you start to fall asleep, or maybe you can get a free beer or something halfway, just to keep people here. Yeah. So my name is Kristian Lars Ahlmark. I'm an architect, urban planner, designer from Schmidt Hammer Lassen, where I'm also the creative director of our studio in Copenhagen. This is us. We are roughly 120 people in our studio in Copenhagen. We also have a studio in Aarhus where we sit 20. That's where the company was founded, and we have an office in Shanghai. And we're not just architects. When you see this group here, I would say roughly 70% of the people you see in the picture, maybe a little bit less, are trained as architects. Obviously, we also have technical architects, but we also have more and more anthropologists, makers, doers, people who work with computational design. We have 10 of those sitting right in the studio in Copenhagen now, developing our own software, as I'm also going to show a few examples of today, how we sort of use that to approach design, and you look at design as an ecology. So as said, we come from Denmark, Aarhus and Copenhagen, but are working vastly across the world, with roughly 80% of our projects right now being done outside Denmark. It's still sort of our base and where we have a lot of work ongoing, but working vastly across the globe and in all scales. And this is just sort of a few of the projects. You can see everything from pavilion-like structures. I think even this little gem here from Edmonton, not so far from here, is a little library that we did some years back, and then all the way up to larger master planning. And libraries is kind of also maybe a key to our body of work at this given moment. We've done 18 libraries, from Shanghai Library that just opened in China, Christchurch, New Zealand, and then of course to Halifax, Edmonton, Copenhagen, and many other places across the globe. But this is my hometown. I just brought these pictures always to give a little context, and a lot of people also just before we start this lecture, when I'm walking around, it seems as if everybody has not just a knowledge but also an attitude towards Copenhagen as the city of livability. It's we've gone from this notion of being the royal family, hence Christian Andersen and Arne Jacobsen, to being all about swimming in the harbor, bicycles, and public spaces. And this is our studio. It sits right on the waterfront, so we have a very nice view to a few of the projects we did over the time, the Royal Library in Copenhagen and a few other buildings around the waterfront. And it's kind of interesting, I moved to Copenhagen back in '92, where the city was actually put under public administration from the state because the economy was so terribly poor. The city was kind of dealing with its infrastructural and housing problems by pushing people to the suburbs. But slowly, by redeveloping and actually using architecture and urban redevelopment as a means of changing the city, they got people to stay within the city and thereby, tax the state and remain within the city. And it sort of became the first step on this amazing transformational journey that happened in Copenhagen in just 20 years. It's hard to believe that the city that I moved to literally was like going bust to the city you have today, which is one of the most livable cities in the world. And a lot of that is kind of due to, just these two things to the left is kind of like the very sort of known Jan Gehl's approach to city planning, live space buildings. I think it's important to say, for us, it's not just like a phrase. It's basically sort of an approach that is now even embedded into the first Danish architectural policy that was launched back in 2006. And you can see the very sort of striking title, putting people first, sort of speaks about everything. Really, this is at the core of what we do. Also, when we talk about architecture and not just city planning, it's always about speaking about city life or urban life. What kind of life is it that we want to create or provide spaces for? Then we plan the spaces, and then after that we start talking about the architecture of the buildings and how they can actually support the two others. And always in this order. If it's done the other way around, it'll never work. Trust me. So, our office, sort of three things that, are at the core of everything we do, and hopefully you'll see that today. The journey I'm sort of going to take you on is both like going a little bit back and just show some projects we did some years back, and then of course touching upon tall buildings, contextual tall buildings, timber, and then finally touching a little bit about adaptive transformation, which is what we are looking more and more into, not just us, but all of us in this room, that this is basically what most of us architects are going to be busy with for the next part of our career, basically. But this idea or the notion about context, that context matters, not just the physical, but also the social and cultural, that each project somehow must relate to the place which it's built. Then, and I don't know if that's our Scandinavian upbringing, we just had this discussion before the lecture, where one of the big things that I always find a little bit hardworking here in North America is the split between like a design architect and an architect of record, whereas we truly believe that the devil does lie hidden in the detail, that architecture doesn't stop after the concept or the schematic design, but something that needs to be brought through all the way to the very end. And then obviously, last but absolutely not least, the idea of creating spaces for people. As Jan Gehl again said, the good city is like a good party. It's like where people want to stay a little longer. And the fact that the biggest attraction for people in the end is people, not architecture, not parks, but people. So design as an ecology, it's like, it kind of just wraps up what I was just saying, the way that we look upon these different stages, both about social infrastructure and how architecture can become a means or mediator to create spaces that brings people together. We say operational here, but really talking about, again, adaptive transformation. How can we be architects and work within existing buildings and structures, and an environmental approach, of course, looking at new materials like timber, for instance, which I'll also show is by far new, but actually one of the oldest building materials we have and one of the most sustainable and long-lasting. So the first part here about, the social mediator, if you will, and this is something that we sort of live by, the idea of using architecture, that we like to believe at least that we design buildings that enhance social interaction. It's kind of what we want them to do, regardless, as I will show, also of the building's function. So obviously not just working with cultural buildings that have the advantages of normally being open and for everyone, but also with private clients, trying to make them understand by actually creating public spaces, interaction. They will also increase value of their buildings, of their architecture. So traveling a little bit back, this is a project, a competition we won back in It was when I just joined the company, one of the first projects I actually worked on as a competition back in 2000, the Aarhus Museum of Art in the city of Aarhus, where we founded the company. So the design or the competition was to create, it was an open competition, an open call with more than 300 entries to do a new art museum. Sort of there was an art collection in the city that was like way larger than the space they had. And our approach sort of became this very sort of pragmatic. I can't see anything. No, so there's like, you know, the famous architect Arne Jacobsen and his city hall up here and the park, and the old city park and the old museum, right? And the site was right here, and most of the entries sort of created like a classical museum-like structure with a cascading series of rooms that one led to another. And we sort of we wanted to try something different and said like, what if sort of the museum became the mediator of urban space? So try to do the project as compact as possible. So we went as low as we could, as we were allowed, and as tall as allowed by the local area plan or the zoning plan. And then basically we sort of said, let's take a road and just like take it straight through the building and make it a public shortcut that goes through the museum. So we sort of have like this monolith that reflects upon the brick architecture you see in the rest of the city. It's kind of hovering, but it sort of picks up people and takes them right through this street that then cuts through the museum. So this is a free route, and the whole idea here was just to say like, maybe if we then put the public art on display on that route, it would sort of create this space of interaction where people come in, they see the art, they get intrigued, maybe they'll buy a ticket, they will visit the museum, they'll sit in the cafe, the bookshop, and sort of become just like this space that was more than this, to some people at least, highbrow, elitist, culturist institution as an art museum, but became more just as a cultural hub. So you see people like dragging their bike through or with their strollers with the babies, and here you have like some of the permanent collections now, like this Valkyrie Wren that's always on display, and the art piece Boy by Ron Muick that sits on the lower levels, where you also have the loading dock, so as a completely free and public interactive part of the museum, and creating like this notion of people just passing through, people going into the museum, but also using, you know, obviously inspired by sort of the light architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright and the Guggenheim Museum, where you know the dynamics and motion of movement inside the museum, people traveling from ground floor and up, also became part of what was on display inside the museum. And when we won the competition, well, obviously, but one of the ideas was also that we wanted to activate the roof and do some sort of a sculpture park up there. And at the time when the building was done, the funding was not in place. But later on, that's a good thing, like we collected the funding and teamed up with Olafur Eliasson, sort of reclaimed Danish Icelandic artist, to do a piece sitting on top. And he came up with the idea, well, with us. I mean, he said, like, let's do a rainbow, and then it was up to us to build it. As you can see, there's no structure inside of it. The glass keeps everything, and trying to place this building on already existing structure, I think, like, is actually one of the hardest tasks we ever had to do. But the piece is called Your Rainbow Panorama, and what's interesting about it is that it sort of, again, brings people into the museum, like even people who, I mean, clearly people go up there also using it almost like as a, like the sort of this link between something very commercial and the art. They go up there. I heard people say like, why is it all these colors? Like, you can't even see the view, but they go up, they pay the ticket, and then they use the museum just to come up. And the idea is really like just to have people reflect and have another view back upon the city, their hometown, or as tourists have an absolutely crazy experience walking up there. And now, right now, we're working with this gentleman, James Turrell, on another edition of the project, and sort of goes back to our idea of making this extremely compact building and leaving as much public space free. Next to it, we actually now have like the possibility to create one of his absolutely magnificent light spaces. It's going to be like the same size as the dome of the St. Paul's Cathedral. So like you have the museum there with the stair, then there's going to be like a series of underground connecting spaces here, and then the dome is going to be out here at the end. But then again at the park, as you can see here, it's going to double as a park of a playscape that's going to be in the public park, as you see, with new pieces of art and sort of the last extension, if you will. This is some of the visualization. It's well underway now and under construction and will open next year with the new underground galleries and the huge light space. So not so far from here, and where are you? There's a person in here who actually visited the museum and we'll wait, Guy, somewhere down there. Oh, there you are. We're just discussing this. It's in the same city, and a project we did, we won the competition back in 2009, and again, it's on a scale that it was both a master plan for a redevelopment of the inner harbor of the city of Aarhus, and at the same time, they wanted what they called a media library. And basically, it was like, I mean, there was a funny architectural critic that called it the Versailles castle of the welfare state. So basically, like taking everything that we really love in Scandinavia, which is like civic functions, like, you know, where you can come down and you can meet the city, it's public transportation, it's young startup, it's playgrounds, and it's just everything that's sort of embedded into, like, you know, this free way of life that should be part of this building. And at the same time, it would be the first building that would connect the inner city and the industrial harbor. So it's placed right here, you know, and at the time this was actually put underground, but this stream here was like then reopened to create a new urban space. So it comes in almost as this hinge where you come down and kind of mediates the people that follow the stream down right where the Vikings actually settled, you know, more than 1,000 years ago and created the city of Aarhus. And as this, like, you know, this hinge really that takes people and turn them around both into the building and also looking out. And this is like, at that time we already did a few libraries, but kind of taking it to a new level where we were really into like trying to going from this collection to the more like social. So like, as we say, like as a catchphrase, from like collection to connection inside the building as a more social oriented space. So here you sort of see the harbor as it looked before, and here with the library. And so really like almost like this sandwich, this layering of different functions. We wanted really to embrace the idea and contextually meet the kinetic structures of the harbor. So we kind of saw the building as this huge covered market space. So we have like these 8 columns or cores that keep everything in place. Then all the slabs are just like rotating around them, and then the big roofscape that contains all the office spaces you see up there to the sort of diagrammatic sections to the left. Up there you have all the sort of the startup business spaces. So the sort of the incubator space is up, then the big floating space in between with what we call the media ramp, but all kinds of activities takes place. And then below, like all the public transportation, both with a new light rail, but also 600 fully automatic parking spaces. The idea was there not to create more spaces for cars, but actually by doing that, we liberated all these parking spaces in the old medieval town. So it sort of was a part of a strategy to say, like, people who come in here on the ring road, park the car, and then walk into the city. So it becomes like this hub where a lot of activities and functions goes on. And as you will see, maybe also in many of our other projects, always with integrated art here, a piece called Magic Mushroom by Dragstad and Elmgren. So this like big city turned upside down. It could look a bit like Calgary actually on its head as a chandelier. We had a few incidents there because you have people like, you know, it's a very nice Instagrammable moment standing there, but it's the same place where you actually have the cars going in to the fully automatic, you know, but no real injuries so far. And then around that, we sort of had like this plateau that sort of snakes around. The big stair is used or double as a tribune for like different festivities, music things, like where you just sit on the stair, and then you have like this big hovering disc cantilevering above the space. And once you're in, you're just met of this like, it's actually, despite its size, it's quite sort of full of tranquility. And the guy was there, like actually working as a part of the architecture school, doing a robotic show or whatever down there. We have people flying drones inside the spaces, all kinds of different functions. Even now, we actually did a quite extensive sort of post-occupancy survey on this building and found that it's the most used building of the University of Aarhus, even though it's not part of the university. It's just the students that attend the university, they find it much more delightful to come down here. Like you see the girl with the chair sitting, reading her book, looking at the view. All the furniture is loose, so people come in, they just move it around and form spaces. And again here, this is actually me with my family, and truthfully, I didn't know we were photographing the building that day. You have the big gong right in the center, and every time a child is born in the municipality, like the gong would sound and the whole library is then washed with the sound, and everybody knows there's a new young citizen in the city of Aarhus. Just looking a little bit around, we kind of like took the space, like the playscape that sits around, and treated it. We wanted sort of to make it also a learning scape, so treat it almost like as a compass. So when you move around, you sort of meet a gorilla from Africa, the Icelandic volcano, and a Chinese dragon. And here, side by side, actually, like the North American eagle and the Russian bear. So today, almost sort of taking on this geopolitical attitude of just bringing together nations playfully at the time, and kids are coming up there just to explore the space and go in and learn about the different areas in here. And here you see the library. As you can see in the images, we kept all the colors, especially on the interior, quite muted, very sort of sand and gray to really meet the scale and color of the harbor. And then once you're inside, it's much more full of color, detail, wood, and all these kind of details. And one thing that was very important for this project is actually how it was developed in this extremely close correlation with the city and the citizens and the librarians and everybody who was like going to use the building afterwards. So the building as it looked when we won the competition and how it ended up looking, the core of it, the core idea is still the same, but it was really a building that was developed in such a tightly knitted feedback structure with the city and all the people who are going to use the building. And this sort of learning was something we also took to this building. I had to show today because it's one of the projects. We have quite a few projects actually here in Canada, way more than we have in the US. I think it's quite nice for us to be here at both Calgary and Vancouver and Toronto, where we have quite a few projects. And this was actually our first project in Canada, in Halifax, the Central Library. So in Nova Scotia, this very beautiful port city of Nova Scotia. And the building of the library was to replace this existing building from the 1950s, basically very traditional, very stony, very closed. And the way we developed it here, and we had like these public consultations, 6 of them, very big ones, also inviting in, to your point, indigenous people of Nova Scotia and their spaces. I'm not going to show the full project because it's a lecture on its own, but actually they had a tone of voice on what kind of spaces they saw happening in this space. And then all the results of that, we actually tried something completely crazy, but it worked quite well, was that our entire design process we also put on display. So all the different models we developed, we put in the old library so people could come down there and talk about it. And this was actually the project, one of the final models that people picked together with us. And as you can see, this is how the building looks today. It's kind of like, it's, again, speaking about context, and sometimes the approach can also to be, at least in terms of materials, sort of non-contextual, because we really wanted to do something here that was very different in its attitude to everything else in Nova Scotia, but still it picks up on the colors and the movement and the way that, the living room that sits on top, the public living room, is just pulled to one side. That allows us to go taller than allowed, because the little twist, there was some sightlines from the old citadel that had to look, where the sightlines where they used to shoot guns at enemy ships, what do I know? But up there, but by doing that, we could actually liberate a bit more of the ground floor to do this little park in front of it. And at night, obviously, the red spaces where they have the old collection, and then we have all the new spaces below. And then just this fun little story, this dude here, this was the time where, we also had sessions where we brought in kids to have their opinion of what a library should be like. And at that time was where Harry Potter was kind of the big thing. So he said why don't you do a library, where you do the Hogwarts one? It's the best library in the world. So So we actually like decided to watch the movie and sort of took that as an inspiration. Maybe this could be a space for us. So it ended up like having this notion and the whole idea of creating a space for serendipity, like, where the way in is not necessarily the way out. People sort of move around in the space. This project was actually, I think this was completed at the time where the one you have here in Calgary started. And we've seen a lot of projects like where atriums come in and becomes like this center space where a place of interaction and socializing. Even this kid here came in and had a good time at one point. So now I'm gonna like have a sip of water and sort of shift to something a little bit different, but still again around the same thing. Because in a way it's kind of like, well, everything is obviously connected, but also a little bit of a lean into the timber tower that I'm going to talk about. But like a lot of the things that that we've been dealing with, like in Denmark, well, in Europe at large, and in Scandinavia even more so, like towers or tall buildings is like, it's a very rare animal on the savanna, if you will. Like we don't really have any of them, but we've been invited to more and more, and we talk about more and more, especially about the whole sort of idea of densification of our city centers, building them around infrastructural hubs. It could make sense, that we need to live a little bit closer together. So in the office, we had a lot of discussions also where we just tried to talk our way around what a high rise and what it could be. And obviously going back to Yemen back in the 14th century, one of the first sort of known high rise cities. And obviously here, there's this notion almost like, obviously it's vernacular architecture. It's not done out of profit or as a commodity or an investment. It's because it makes sense in that environment to build close, dense, and it actually worked for them. And then obviously you have Bologna. It's actually a little bit before Yemen. Well, it's not a picture, but it's a description of what it was. And here, like one of the first examples where high rise was actually sort of an outcome of wealth, where families were competing against each other, and most of the buildings were built without purpose, more than just to show off the amount of wealth. But still, there's two of them left, and they're absolutely gorgeous. Of course, they're very slim, very slender. They're leaning and look like they're about to crash. But there's something, maybe because like the power of numbers, and sort of the second time you see it is maybe in Manhattan. To the left you see Bologna again, and then Manhattan, where suddenly like there's a certain uniformity in the way that the high rises create something that works together. Although in the last years one might actually argue that New York are also seeing a new breed again of more sort of conceptualized high-rise that speaks more about themselves than the unity. Whereas in Europe, like we more had this approach, like when Le Corbusier, where there was a lot of modernists that wanted to do high-rises, he maybe owned the biggest idea of doing the Villa Radial in Paris, and the idea of sort of pretty much knocking down the first and second arrondissement in the center of Paris. And obviously it didn't happen because they did it once, and so it came from epic to an epic fail. And actually I took this picture. I was doing a talk a few weeks ago with Brent Tuderian, who worked here in Calgary years back, and he always talks about sort of the Montparnasse complex or syndrome, the way that you do one high rise that is so bad that you're never going to do it again. And this is just Paris, and we have the same in Copenhagen, Oslo, Stockholm, these almost like self-inflicted wounds we created in the 60s that prevented other species of high rise really to exist. The only place you could say really where we do have sort of a skyline is in London, a little bit Frankfurt is coming along, but London, but then again like a non-homogenic one where each of them sort of try to be something, so they all try to paint a picture, like whether it's the Gherkin or the cheese grater or the walkie-talkie or the R2-D2, like so you have sort of this, maybe I'm not pointing a finger, but for better or worse, but almost like the idea of the Star Wars cantina for those of you who saw the original one, where sort of you come in and they just put all these freakish people together to create sort of a strange sense of homogenic, even though each of them looks very different. And again, like this is just me googling Blender, and again, like each of these blenders are different, but they're all the same, right? and to the right you have the skyline of Doha, and in some way you sort of get the same imagery. It's basically a high-rise. So we became quite interested in why is it that we talk about tall buildings like we go to something that's almost like objectified. Like whereas when we talk about everything from 1 to 5 floors, it's a different set of rules where we talk about contextualism, and suddenly it becomes an object. So whether it's a blender or high-rise, it's sort of at the same scale, and then I guess architecture is everything in between. And then obviously like the notion of also like this is something we're met with a lot, like that tall buildings are always like in pop culture depicted as evil. Whether it's to the left you have the Tower in Metropolis, Fritz Lang's famous movies from the early 1900s, and then obviously Tolkien's Tower. And do anyone know the one to the right?
Trump Tower.
No. It's where JR lived in Dallas. Like so I think only a few of you, but I see you out there. You know, I grew up with this. But it's literally like, you know, the streets in Denmark were like dead. Like we only had one television channel in the 80s. So and almost nothing from the US. So we are a social democratic country. So, you know, things important from the US are taken in smaller portions. So all in all, sort of we have like this list, and this is very much the debate, you know, where we talk about high-rise, you know, the pros and cons, like the symbolic value, but also symbols of power, like that they are economically attractive. And we talk about that is also that most municipalities love high-rises because it's also a symbol of a city that's doing well, because they're incredibly expensive to build. But obviously you see, and the same here in Calgary, you know, they do become these investment properties. It becomes commodities. Like we talk about the London paradox, that it's the city, one of the cities in the world where you have the sort of the highest demand for housing, but still the most empty buildings in the city centers. Like in Toronto, the same. Calgary, yes, the same. Like so, all this empty structure, and then of course the idea of providing density, but also you feel the city somehow becomes less intriguing, less interesting, because it shrinks when you can always like see that high rise when you're walking around. So this is a project, you know, where we were. It was a competition to do a sort of this strange, almost like sort of alchemy of functions. It's the city of Malmö. It's just across the water into Sweden, the south of Sweden, in the port city of Malmö. Actually, sort of the first truly industrialized city of Sweden in the south, and also sort of a city that has this strange relationship with its own heritage, as has been Danish as much as Swedish, you know, and thereby, you know, there's been a lot of genocide going on. Little people know that, but you know, the king of Stockholm came down and just got rid of all people who were in favor of Denmark, and pretty much just like got rid of them. So always sort of have this controversy with itself and being Swedish and being an industrial city. And at one point, the industry, as in many other cities, sort of are starting to move out. It's definitely not inside the city anymore. And they wanted to sort of to take some of that newly liberated space and see how they could change the culture. But as they could not afford in any means a cultural house, they came up with the idea of doing something that had two legs, quite interesting actually. So at one point they wanted a new Philharmonic Orchestra Symphony Hall, as Malmö has one of the best orchestras in the world. And at the same time marrying that cultural component with something as commercial as a conference hotel. And rather than doing a conference hotel sort of in the outskirts of the city, doing it right in the heart of the city and doing it all at once, so they could free up some 20-25% of the construction cost by actually sharing the common spaces of the two. Which, you know, in many ways is such a great idea. I mean, the amount of heat we're using on warming up lobbies in our cultural buildings, and then they're just standing empty until people come and use them is an enormous problem. So the way we sort of looked upon this was trying to take this extensive program and then break it down into a scale where it took up almost like this city in a city-like concept. So each of them would be addressing the different areas. The thing was that normally, and this diagram here pretty much shows 95% of all concert halls, conference spaces in the world. So to the left, you sort of have the normal configuration. You have a front of house and a back of house, like, and this sort of the halls. has like a front in the front and sort of, well, obviously the back in the back where you feed them, and then you have a lobby normally facing like a grand view, and the rest is sort of turning its back of the city. But as this project didn't really have a front side nor a back side, but was addressing many parts of the city, we really wanted to break it down, so we created like this cluster and pushed the logistics below grade. So actually, like the loading dock became one of the clusters, everything goes below grade and up, and we pushed the lobby one floor up, so the whole ground floor is kept open and public. And at the same time, we broke down the volume, sort of using these first 5 floors as a mediator to create something that actually addressed the other sides. So what you see to the right is the hotel, the tallest part that we broke into 3 little pieces, so to create something that fit the scale of the city better. And then you have a restaurant, the conference center, the concert hall, and so on. To create like these different, become this mediator of different spaces. The big boardwalk where you sit sort of with this building in the back towards the waterfront for the first time, actually utilizing the canal in the city that was mainly just used for like throwing in stolen bicycles we found when we were excavating it. But suddenly you sort of had this space full of art and activities, and then different green spaces sort of coming around the building, creating whole new scenery at what before the project used to be a parking lot. And sort of for this contextual relationship, we started to study the colors of the city, finding that even though it lies only like a stone throw from Copenhagen, the color setting of the city is much more inspired by sort of North German merchants. As I was saying in the beginning, like Malmö was a strange city, not belonging to Denmark and not really sort of being part of Sweden, but was like almost this Pirates Bay of the Hansestädter. It was called North German merchants that were traveling the Strait of Øresund. So sort of trying to dress the entire building in these colors using 10,000 square meters of these ceramic shingles, trying to like capture the colors of the city, but also we wanted sort of to make sure we didn't fall in the trap of creating a concert hall with a conference center next to it, but something that actually had the same uniform scale facade coming all the way around. That kind of like blends in with the city. So in a way, we wanted something that looked as, you know, it was already there, and something that was never there before, sort of at the same time. And then all these openings sort of create a pattern that continues across the facade that creates this almost sort of cobweb-like structure towards the canal. And here you see the ground floor plan, but the same pattern with these sort of watery clouds. It used to be water fill at the area where the little boats were, so we wanted to celebrate that and how that's completely open. So once you come in, all the big elements are then cladded in these big prefab concrete elements to keep costs down. The different sort of the pattern in it creates this beautiful acoustic. So here you see kind of like the lower floor with the stone, and then upper lobby up here that just works at this fluid space in between, almost like, you know, the mortar between the bigger spaces. And then finally the concert hall, where you sort of have like, you know, again changing the attitude from the ceramics, the concrete that celebrates sort of the history of the city, which very much is centered around the prefab concrete and then the wood inside. And here at one just opened recently a project in the city of Oslo, trying to sort of, in a way, do a bit of the same, but with a very commercial building. So this building was standing on the site before. It was already like beginning to be knocked down, so we couldn't do much to save it, even though that's something that we want to do and we like to do. And it's a building that stands right in the city center, creating almost this fortress-like situation with absolutely sort of becoming almost like congestion in the city. So it was a competition, and the client was allowed to do the exact same amount of square meters that was there before, no more, no less, but they could like redevelop the site as it was really poorly built and almost sort of starting to come apart. And what we said was like maybe to try to excavate the heart of the site and create this new, as you see like here, these new diagonal passages across the site, connecting some quite important parts of the city with a new public square that may not be big, but was something that was not there before. And then at the same time, and the reason why I show this as contextual high-rise is it's above 40 meters, and everything above 40 meters in Oslo is considered a high-rise, and we are almost at 64. But the way we do it is actually lifting it up and creating like this access point where you go through, and then at the same time just pushing it back so it actually didn't seem as tall as before. And then at the ground floor, keeping everything open and also convincing the client that all of the office spaces should have their address towards the courtyard. Even though they were like, no, they wanted to the outside, they wanted to be able to come in the car and walk straight in, but creating this space of activation. And then, you know, so what are the challenges with the site? With this, the site drops like 1.5 floor across the site. It's very slopey. We created like this big stair that moves up again, that doubles as a sitting stair, and you walk in, you have like this big opening that we wanted to be like a little pond inside a clearing, and then creating a space that actually would evoke feelings, even though it was kind of tight. So when you see it from the outside, the building is quite sort of, you know, it builds upon this existing structure. You know, with these gables, you kind of see all the way down this ridge that you have in the city, almost like a stone quarry, like you will find right outside Oslo. So the facade is actually, and that's another lecture, you know, obviously how we deal with facade and UDG value. So it's the first huge closed cavity facade in Europe, which means 3 layers of glass, then a space that's always in pressure, overpressure, and then another layer, so we have an active solarization within that space, which is also then what allows us to have this beautiful, playful movement of the glass, sort of to depict the outside area where you have a residential neighborhood where the windows were always like half open, half closed, and also sort of to break the reflections of the facade. And then you have these openings, and what we wanted to do was really to work with this dualism that once you entered and you move in, this is the stair that leads up. You have like retail space and restaurants and all kinds of public spaces and the ground floor. You sort of come in and reminds you of like stepping into a clearing in a Norwegian wood. You have the big reflecting mirror that brings daylight deep down to the retail spaces below. And then you just have like this extreme verticalism, almost like trunks of trees, when you walk in, and suddenly, like when you go there, you can see, like, you know, people will always move from A to B if it's faster. So you have like this just like this motion of people, this dynamic of people walking through this space. You have kids on skateboards blending in with the lawyers and bankers, who are obviously the only ones who can afford to live in a building like this. And then people going to eat and just hang out at the stair, and the way that kind of like it just encapsulates and look up upon the sky. So moving from this tall contextualism to talking about this super tall timber building that we're working on right now, I just wanted, like, again, as a bit of reflection on working with timber and working with wood, which is obviously not new to us, and not new to us as Danes or probably Canadians either. It's something that we've been done since the dawn of time, because it is a super strong material. But somehow, like all of these buildings, even our own castles, are done as timber construction. It just has a raincoat of brick, but the whole structural system is timber. We obviously went to this, you know, the efficiency in the post-war period, where we needed to build a lot of buildings very fast, and we did what we refer to as the crane track architecture. So the reason why the buildings are laid out like this is basically because this was the most efficient way to have a crane like right in the middle and putting all the concrete elements up. In Denmark, we don't cast on site. Everything is done as element, as we are in a complete non-seismic zone. It's a very sort of sustainable way of working and doing things off-site. And then obviously there's the notion of fire, the fact that Copenhagen burned down, not just once or twice, but several times. And that, you know, gave timber a bad name, even though like some of the best buildings we have in Copenhagen today, like this is actually the oldest existing building, the old brew house, like, which I absolutely love because it looks like a residential building on steroids, like this huge structure that you come in and it's completely intact. And this, again, it's a load-bearing timber structure going from wall to wall. Again, the facade is not load-bearing, it's only a raincoat. And we did a number of projects just showing like a little bit of different methodology we've been working on. So this is a building we did for the frigate Jutland, which is the biggest wooden ship in the world. Even that, in a funny way, speaks to the fact that, you know, wood is a very long-lasting material. This is a ship, you know, it's been in water for 600 years and it still stands there today. And in this building here, we actually used hardwood and used like old mythology to do this visitor centers for the ship. So even though it looks as an old building, it's actually something we did quite recently. And here in airport, a small airport we did in the north of Jutland, here using glulam as a structure, and obviously the qualities that has, the long span and the capability of bending it. And we just wanted to do something as clean, as simple as possible. So it's basically just like this big hall with a glulam structure. But also been involved in quite a lot of residential building. This is one we've done for a private client. It's the Lego family, but don't tell anyone. It's a hunting cabin they have, and here using again glulam as main structure, but also elements of CLT to create the space. And I just squeezed this one in because it's in Vancouver. It's a project we're doing with our colleagues from Perkins & Will. I didn't say that in the beginning. We're Schmidt Hammer Lassen, but we're also part of the global company Perkins & Will that has an office right here in Calgary, one in Vancouver, one in Toronto. So this is a joint operation for a university building, the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, at the Gateway building that uses cross-laminated timber structure as the main structural component. But a little bit before that, and this is something we kind of like took in our own hands. We could see, even though we've been working on projects like the Frigate Jutland and smaller mansions, etc., the notion for creating office spaces in timber was still more or less non-existing in Denmark. So with a little group of clients, we came up with the idea, let's just do it ourselves and go all the way and do something where we also incorporate the idea of design for disassembly, because it's one of the things with wood, actually it has the capability of, as a lightweight structure, to actually be built and taken apart again. So we came up with this idea of do something, we call it the frame house. The way we did it was that we sort of made a radius outside Copenhagen of roughly 30 kilometers, and then we investigated where the most one or two main companies existed, and that was where we wanted to put it, to create something where they could come rather than sitting home in the garage and work. They could come together in this space, in this flexible space. So the idea here is creating these platforms, basically like playing with Meccano or Lego. The thing with this is that it doesn't care what it is. It doesn't care if you build a rocket or a helicopter or a motorcycle. It can be taken apart and being put back in. So like the structure is completely flexible like that. So this is sort of the main structure of the building, like where we have like this, we call it platforms, like, where the frames can always be extended and you can add these lightweight structures in between. So here you see under construction, it was done extremely fast. All the frames in the frame house were done off-site, and it's basically just glulam. We didn't even use like new cutting edge CLT components that we can get today. Just like build up the decks, filled it up with wood chip as insulation, and then you have like this really nice space. And the fun thing is like we go there a lot, not just with clients but also like at the studio, because when you come, it's always like a new space. Then they put up a new mezzanine. Last time they built 3 more frames like to get more tenants in there. So it sort of become like this almost organic approach to working with lightweight product as timber. And then, of course, just to show this is, my and all my fellow partners' summer houses, like, that's where we always work with timber. Very Scandinavian, but very small scale, but just to use it as a segue to the Rocket&Tigerli, because, the question for us when we enter this international competition to do the world's tallest high-rise is obviously not only to challenge, understand, and work with the system, but also to see how can we bring the qualities, of the summer house into a very hardcore, prefabricated, highly also expensive and very difficult moon landing as doing a 100-meter tall timber construction residential. So then going into the Rocket&Tigerli, which is going to be the world's tallest residential timber construction. So it was a competition we didn't think we would get in, but we did get through the eye of the needle. 8 companies came in, and we sort of said, okay, let's set out to, again, a little bit of learning before, to try to work with something that we could almost call the anti-tower, because the idea obviously was to do the tower, but also to do the smaller buildings. So the reason why it's called Rocket&Tigerli, that was the name of of the competition is because of the site. So this is in a place called Winterthur. It's right outside Zurich in Switzerland, and inside Winterthur you have this area called Lokstadt. So Lokstadt, Lok short for locomotive or locomotive, is where you could say like they were driving or pulling the industrial revolution of Europe in the early 1900s by creating these trains that were used all over Europe. So obviously lots of pollution, lots of coal, lots of factory, but also a place, where you had this character, at a time where our industrial buildings were almost looked upon as our cathedrals, like so. A site and a setting and a context so rich and so full of details. So we started looking actually at the original master plan, and what can be quite interesting about these post-industrial sites is sort of this spatial hierarchy. It's almost like creating architecture without architects. The urban spaces, the way you move around to very narrow spaces, but also structures that take up an almost urban-like scale. So this is the new master plan, and our building is the little cut-up one here. But it didn't look like that in the beginning. So actually, there was already a master plan created by a local architectural office, Chigongier, some of you might know them, really good ones, that depicted to create this perimeter block with a tower on it. And the only sort of thing which we really liked was you can see there's a train track going through, that's why it's open. So part of the program was that actually these train tracks were to be remained, because there's this little turnstile here, is where they still have one of the trains left. They have a cafe in, and the idea was actually that cafe should be able to move through the site and be where the sun was. So these are the four functions: a hotel in the blue one, the green one being cooperative housing, student housing, and then residential in the red one. But the first thing we did was obviously to challenge the brief and say, okay, why don't we cut it up? And we did this sort of for several reasons. One of them was maybe to try to talk about this industrial fabric, the way that you always move from space to space for something very narrow to something very open. We also said, as a financial benefit, it's always good when you do a project and you want to do something architectural to find some financial hook to hang your idea on. And here obviously it was that we could use the more expensive tube-in-tube system that I'll come to in a while on the tower, and then maybe just use a much more conventional cross-laminated timber system in the small ones. And at the same time, they could also do it in stages or sell off the different components. Of course, creating something that evokes urban porosity, and even more importantly, also create identity. So rather than having a high-rise, which is going to be the most expensive condominiums, and then just the rest as this fluid mass in the lower parts, we wanted really them to have their own address, again, to build upon the idea of good city life. This is my city, this is my neighborhood, this is my building, this is my door, right? So rather than just living in a nameless perimeter, you sort of created these four clearly and distinctive identities. Then we sort of added all these areas of engagement, not just on the ground floor, but also on the roofs, and creating connecting spaces in the middle of the tower and on the rooftop, spaces for green spaces, biophilia, etc. And took all the public spaces, obviously the retail of the hotel, but also things like the bicycle repair place, the laundry, etc. and on the ground floor. And then the idea of creating this daylight, and obviously we did severe analysis to really prove that by doing this we would get much better daylight into the building. But we also have this program. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but again, this is something we developed ourselves. It's called profiterole. So as we say, it's the sweet side of profit. That we use sort of to convince clients actually that what we do is a good idea. So this is what we have. But the thing is that with this software, then we can take all kinds of key indicators, not that we provide, but we get from the client. How much is a window worth? How much is this worth? And actually by doing that, convincing them that even though we cut it up and they'll use square meters, we did reach the same amount, but we had to be a little bit more careful, but you will get much more value. But also trying to value green spaces, the daylight that come in that allows us to have trees all of a sudden. The courtyard is also worth something. And we did also these extensive daylight analysis where we don't just look at the daylight on the ground floor, but also all the light that hits the balconies across the day. So we could say people would actually come in and spend time in the courtyards. And finally, And this was quite interesting. From the 8 projects, one would say, like, you're given a master plan, you're giving a structural system, at least indications of it, that you'll get like 8 proposals that are the same. But basically, none of us, like Big, who did also a very remarkable high-rise here in the city, was a part of it, 3XN amongst us, none of them did the same. So that strain jacket also became maybe so provocative that people tried to do their own style. We, however, tried to say maybe we could celebrate and use the structural system to our benefit and see like what we could get out of it. So here's sort of the idea of opening up, also creating this space as a mediator between the already existing spaces, and here you kind of see how it goes through. You have the little train there, and what obviously happens, you can almost imagine that if this was blocked here, you wouldn't be able to see the old assembly halls, and all of a sudden it's brought in and it kind of makes sense. It's going to be a hotel in that space and restaurants, and that sort of becomes much more a part of this urban space here. Just some model pictures. So this also, like when it comes to the facade, the industrial character, this is going to be the facade components. We're working with this reclaimed brick shingles that we're cutting off. And as you can see, like the colors are kind of taken from the surrounding areas, the red, this thin yellow, and the green that you'll find inside the halls. And here you have the plans. I'm going to go a little bit quickly over here, but obviously one of the things we said, like none of the units should have daylight from just one side. So here you have some of the corner apartments, the student housing that we'll be doing by unitized system and lifting in. That goes for the hotel as well. And you sort of have the entire structure as we see it for all the components here. And the idea is actually, to do this as a unitized system so we can bring it up. And this is one of the good things, the many good things we can talk about by working with timber is obviously also that the time saving you have, on construction. We could do it on site, come out and assemble it really, really fast, and then we close it with a rain screen. That's going to be this system. You can see it has a chamfered component here. And the reason why we did that is like when we do a load-bearing structural system here, and this again, this is a complete shift. I'm sure that everything you have here in this city and most cities, when we talk about high-rise, it's curtain wall. We have a concrete slab and a column, and then we hang something. But here we're actually going almost backwards, and we are expressing the tectonics of the building and the facade. And we wanted to do that instead of hiding it. But, a beam that's like 90 by 40 can be a little bit bulky in the facade. So by doing this chamfer, it sort of gets a little bit lighter expression when you see the building from the outside. So the structural system for, I don't know how deep as we go, but I'm sure there are some geeks in the audience. I'm not going to go deep, but it's this thing we call a tube-in-tube system. So it's quite different than cross-laminated timber. This is LVL, so laminated veneer lumber. So it's basically like really, really thick plywood, like pieces of roughly 3 millimeter beechwood that are glued together in these like huge dimensions. So inside in the core we have like this one frames. That means as the building actually doesn't have a core, it has a tube. So even the cores in the building are going to be done in timber. There's no concrete in the stabilizing system. Then outside that we have these slabs. And these slabs here, it's quite genius actually. They're done as staying formwork. So we have a piece of veneer, again, or laminated timber. And then we have insulation in between and then concrete on top. So we use sort of the tensile qualities of the wood and the pressure of the concrete. So this is the little bit of concrete. So when we talk about timber, it's not, we're not fundamentalists. Like we want to use it in the right places. But by doing this, of course, we can reduce size of the slab and thereby, get much more daylight in, but also provide much stronger acoustic qualities. So here you sort of see the middle layer that connects, where we've had a little bit of the insulation, and these are some of the testings. And this is obviously one of the things that's so great about this project, that we are already sort of 4 years into the project with all the initial testing. And another sort of benefit of that is what you see here. This is how we anticipate the apartments are going to be, and obviously we're crossing our fingers, but we can leave as much of the formwork exposed as possible. So even though obviously it's a render, I know it's done by a render company, and the roof might be a little bit more rough, but we don't mind, that, we just sand it down. You might see a little bit of the concrete dripping through. Also on the walls, we can actually expose the LVL timber system to the inside, and have a benefit of the qualities that are within the wood, which is, completely acknowledged, and also like has been like certified. That people, I read that kids' heart rate, they drop in a day in a class 8,300 heartbeats by being in a classroom made of timber as opposed to anything else. So it just has like this soothing, calming notion on human beings to be with timber. And then on the outside we have the other tube, there by the name Tube in Tube. So basically, the project I showed you before, like the old brew house, like the steroid house, is basically the same system. So even though obviously it's engineered and the way that we looked upon it here, it's not like they did it 500 years ago, but in its essence, it's the same way that we have two frames and they're connected and then they become a stiff frame, so we don't need any stabilizing cores. So these are some of the stress tests we made on the system. You see here, like, the beam, as opposed to a normal high-rise where you have a column and a slab. Here, actually, the columns runs all the way through. Like, if you broke it and would do it like as you normally would do, the beam would just be crushed by the sheer weight of the column. So the column runs all the way through the building, and then the beams are attached to the side. They're tensioned by a little bit of steel, and then again to the slab, there's going to be a thin layer of concrete to minimize the depth of it so we can get more daylight into the building. And then there's a high tension mortar stuck in between. This is the one we're stress testing here. And here we are pushing it to 500 kilonewton, which, 200 kilonewton is way more than we can anticipate for a storm in Switzerland. It's not a severe seismic zone. They have little earthquakes, but this is, of course, one of the issues to test how that's done. And then, of course, there's fire. That's the question we get asked, or I get asked the most. As much as people say, oh, I love being in wood, that's one thing because we know it from our summer houses. The next thing you think about is yourself like throwing like a log into a fire and you say it burn. But the thing is that, that everything burns, like our concrete and steel buildings burns as well. Like that's why we have fire regulations and systems. But the thing about timber is actually it burns in a much, much more controlled way than steel. We know steel and concrete, it has a breakpoint where the subject becomes brittle and it would collapse, whereas we know that a timber system like this would burn like 0.6 millimeters per minute. So we know exactly when it will break, and that is basically the thing about fire is about evacuation. It's not about saving the building. When a building has burned, you'll take it down because it's too damaged. And then the charring of the wood would then actually slow down the burning process. So it's all about dimensioning, and then we know exactly what to do. So here the tube and tube system with a different layout. Another thing we work with when you is being very organized around your cores, like our wet cells, the way we place them, so that we could actually create this methodology of different units. So we can turn them like a north-south and an east-west direction, but as you can see, the wet cells always stays in the same place. So we have this system, as some of you might have noticed, we actually are working with two cores here. That actually allows us to have dual aspects apartments running all the way through. So again, speaking to the idea of quality of the housing, right? So obviously you lose a bit of space in the brood-net relationship by having two cores, but each of the house units have daylight from both sides. Some even have double height spaces, and this is what then allows us to have this quite interesting tetriclite motion, because we can shift around the balcony, shift around the apartments, instead of just having everything sitting right on top of each other all the way through. Also using this methodology to create a strategy for the balconies, so the ground floor, to create much better connection to the people walking around. We have the balconies on the outside. This also then pushes the beam to the lower part, and then at the upper part we push the beam up. So instead of being a downstand beam, it becomes an upstand beam. So the beam suddenly becomes part of the living condition on the inside, even becomes part of the rail on the balconies to the outside. And then obviously at the very top we have balconies going all the way around. And just some quick numbers, obviously we calculated now the sort of the embodied carbon, the baseline, and by this one we calculate to reduce it, the carbon footprint by 50%. And as we know that every cubic meter stores approximately 0.9 ton of CO2. These are just some calculations we did with the reduction of the structure. And here seeing that it lies way below the REBA and LEED climate systems. Do we have time for the last chapter? Yes. All right. Yeah, because this is kind of like actually in a way summing it up. I mean, because we also showing some examples of how we also use the lightweight capabilities of timber in different projects. So these are just some sheer facts, and this is just about the global emissions that comes. I mean, that we as architects or builders, whether we like it or not, have like this obligation to look upon how we deal with structures that we are responsible of almost 40% of all greenhouse gases that's getting emitted. These are numbers coming from the UK GBC, the UK Green Building Council, and they're also saying at the same time, as we were talking a little bit about in advance, if we look sort of at towards like 2050, that 80% of all the buildings that needs to be built has already been built. So in a way, there's very little for us to do as architects. So, we could just like wrap up and go home or find another profession, or like try looking upon it in another way. And finally, the two small projects in the end, where we sort of talk about prosthetic architecture, so adding something to existing structure. So again, back to Toronto, to Canada, Toronto, a competition we were invited to do was actually, we're looking at this entire plot here. 3 plots, and there's these silos called the Victory silos standing in the center. So if I had turned the camera like 108 degrees, you'd be looking like straight at the waterfront and the tower and all that right behind you. So this is kind of the last plot, but it also like tells a story about a city development that maybe has gone too fast. At least a lot of the remembrance of what it used to be, the post-industrial structures, has been knocked down so fast that somebody at some point yelled stop and kept this one lonely silo, which is now, when we did the competition, we were told was completely listed, that we couldn't do anything to it. So sort of the normal notion where you would give it a raincoat and turn it into like luxury condominiums was out of the question, as we couldn't disturb the integrity of the silos, as they said. I'm not going to show the entire project, but just like what we did to the silos, we sort of started finding these old city maps, and we saw that it actually used to be part of a structure where the red one there is the silo. There was way more there, so there was always part of this like really intriguing architecture where architects had not been involved. It's all done by engineers, or maybe not even. It's just done like not for aesthetics but out of necessities. And then we said like maybe we can actually like do the building. We were allowed to push it into the silo, but we pushed it away and sort of recreated sort of almost this alleyway and treated the silos almost like as a cathedral. This is Piazza Navona in Rome, like that maybe, because even though that Toronto says it's the city in the world with the most neighborhoods, the one area you don't feel the feeling of neighborhood is down by the waterfront. So maybe this could become it. So our sort of approach was like this almost yin-yang strategy, saying that something that's convex could be concave, light, heavy, concrete, and timber. So we suggested like to do this lightweight pre-manufactured structure on top of the silos that could be a hotel or restaurant, like keeping like the space where the old head house was intact in between. And actually we won, and they brought it up to the city, even though to the city archive, what do you call it, preservatives, and they were just like, yeah, it's good, we like it. They felt actually that it enhanced the feeling of the silos by doing this on top. So that's moving forward, and this final project maybe just sums up everything. A project that we just won in Oslo, and also it's kind of the knowledge that we use also to sometimes again push a little bit against the brief. So this is a bank in Oslo. They own these 2 buildings. It's the 2 you see here. This one here done in 1971 and this one in 1931. And what they asked us to do was actually to create 2 towers. They wanted 2 towers, and we were already like, haven't you heard? People don't want to be in towers anymore. But they really wanted it. One in the front that could be 100 meters tall because of geotechnical, the bedrock is higher there, and the one in the back in the 1970s building could only be 70 meters tall. So the result of that would basically be this, where just hammer 2 towers into the existing structure and end up sort of getting this structural Frankenstein monster with 2 towers that were not really efficient and would also destroy the 2 existing buildings. So we sort of started to look a little bit closer into the sort of integrity of the building. The thing is that we found, and as you may know, buildings done in the 60s and 70s are many times like over-engineers at a time where materials were super cheap and engineering were going up, so they can take way more load than actually they're built for. The other building, however, the one from the 30s, had like, I think it was like 220 to the ceiling height and was in really bad shape. So our strategy became like actually to take the 1931 and take it apart, and we'll show like to keep like as a material bank all the good stone. It had like this really, really good red Norwegian granite that we could reuse, and then say like, let's keep the 1970s and then build on top of it with a lightweight timber structure. So we'd actually get a structure that looked much more like this. A tower to one side and then another building to the other side. And again, one of the arguments was again that you could save money by doing it, but also you will have like different offerings to tenants rather than having two towers that would be the same. You'll have like deep floor plates for like a multi-tenant office with an atrium building and a tower next to it. So we're going to like build an extension on top of it and then redo the lower facade, put in new windows. And so we got this sort of the whole equation that would be like adapt, extend, reuse, perform, and give back. Because by doing this, actually, we could put more square meters. And in the end, and this is obviously what we always like intend to do, is that one of the biggest challenges for this area was not just the client's wish to get more square footage. It's in the part of Oslo where you have the least amount of green spaces. So setting back would actually create all of a sudden a new sort of green space, but also become like an open extension of the lobby. So to the left you see the tower, and to the right the timber extension. And again, using like solid argumentation by pushing back, you can see like how this square could actually become quite a nice daylit space in the heart of the city, where we sort of could see we could extend the period of daylight from 3 hours to around 6 to 7 hours. And the way we organized it, also looking at wind conditions, because we haven't talked about that so much, but turbulence and high rises obviously go hand in hand. So here the little green space around, and you see here like the new lobby where the red stone then has been reused in all the interior spaces inside the bank. And some sort of new urban porosity that goes around the buildings, creating this little art piece that would become the bridge between the two structures. And here you sort of see the two buildings next to each other with the two facades. And here like an aerial with the new setting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristian. That was an amazing piece of work. I have two observations, and then we'll have a couple of questions. The first is what I think is remarkable for everyone here, particularly the students, is to see how deftly you can move from the largest of scales to the smallest of scales. Mm-hmm. From thinking about it as a business idea, as a material investigation, as a technological solution, and as a big conceptual idea, all simultaneously. I think that's the best of what architecture and design can be, and congratulations on achieving that. And I think it was a kind of example of a masterwork that we saw tonight. And then finally, your enthusiasm is infectious. There's a kind of optimistic idea about the way the world can be and what our disciplines can be that I think in this sort of problematic time that we are all existing in is very refreshing, and particularly I think for our students. So thank you very much for that. It was wonderful. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask? I know we're a little over time, but I think it's been worth it. Are there any? Yeah. Yes.
I think you mentioned maybe at the beginning of your presentation that you propose an original idea or original design, and then you transform it once you have like a community input. And then I wanted to ask how you do that, like how do you transition and connect both things? Yeah,
I mean, obviously it differs from project to project. So, for instance, the one in Halifax, and where the process was extremely open, and the one in the Dog one, where we had an initial idea, but it becomes like, we did it like with a series of sessions where we invite people in, And we take feedback, we discuss, we use a lot of model works in all our projects. We find that's still the easiest way to communicate architectural ideas to the people that is going to finally be in the building. So using the models, sketch models, rough models, and then we have discussions, bring in the feedback, and then for that project we sort of had like a core team, that would then sort of digest all the info we got and do a next session where again we presented the work. So it sort of becomes this back and forth session, but it's something like it doesn't happen in all the projects you've seen there. Like for instance, the last one here is a completely private project. It happens then with where we obviously present to different stakeholders, the municipality, the city architect, who then might have some inquiries to why we're doing it and so on and so forth. But it's not a public consultation per se. And then we've done a number of projects also with educational, where obviously we do it with the different staff of the school and just to get in their input on the project. So it's kind of like a process, and we also do a lot of it, which is obviously not public, but the way we attend projects is more and more also with consultants that are not necessarily architects, but people who know about things that lie around a specific object or project that lies out of what we might know.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? All right. Oh, yes, we do have one over there.
Yeah.
I guess one thing you talked about the timber frames.
Oh.
The timber frame carbon holding calculation. Does that include? So is that only for the life cycle of the building, or does that include like once the building is finished its life cycle and it gets demolished, the carbon will still be released?
Yes.
I was wondering, do you know if that's included in the calculation?
It is that is we need to do, and it's actually one of the things that's under a heavy debate right now. For instance, in Denmark, the life cycle for timber is considered 50 years, right? Which we feel as architects is also something that's been pushed upon us by a very strong concrete lobby, who obviously want it to be as low as possible. But as I was showing, we have so many examples, both of if treated and kept properly, that there's no limit to how long timber can actually remain, or also as I showed in the frame house, that it can actually be disassembled and used somewhere else, right? But it's true that right now, you need to calculate also that, and that's where, concrete works, because they say, it'll stay in there. It might be extremely environmentally unfriendly to produce, but once you've done it, it'll stay.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, I think we should probably call this to a close. Thank you. There is the bar is still open. Kristian is here if you have any questions and comments, and I am sure, given the enthusiasm of the lecture, that he'd love to talk to you a little bit more. So thank you all very much for coming. I hope we'll see you on November 30th, and have a safe trip home in this snowy, cold November day. Thank you very much for coming.
Yes. Oh, that's good. Because I only actually was a little bit